The moment power stops listening, justice starts remembering. The phone camera shook as someone in the crowd whispered, "They're arresting her." A chorus of confused voices drifted across the downtown plaza, while flashing blue lights reflected against the polished windows of the federal courthouse just 2 blocks away. In the middle of the gathering stood a black woman in a charcoal gray business suit, her leather briefcase resting neatly beside her feet. She wasn't yelling. She wasn't arguing. She wasn't even trying to walk away. Yet Officer Daniel Carter spoke with complete confidence as he stepped forward. "Ma'am, you're under arrest for disorderly conduct." The words landed like a thunderclap, and almost instantly dozens of strangers pulled out their phones. Someone assumed she must have caused a scene. Another muttered that people who resisted police always had something to hide. The story was already writing itself in the minds of everyone watching, even though almost no one had seen how the encounter began. The woman slowly lifted her eyes toward the officer. Calm, steady, almost impossibly composed. "Officer," she said softly, "I recommend you document everything from this point forward." Her voice carried no anger, only certainty. Daniel frowned at the unexpected response. Most people argued. Some protested. Others begged. She did none of those things. Instead, she folded her hands loosely in front of her and looked directly at him with an expression that was impossible to read. "You can explain yourself downtown," Daniel replied as another officer approached. Around them, the plaza buzzed with speculation. Office workers paused during lunch. Tourists stopped to watch. A delivery driver leaned against his truck, recording every second. The headlines people imagined were already forming before anyone knew a single fact. A young woman standing near the courthouse steps quietly asked, "What did she do?" No one answered. They simply watched. Daniel gestured toward the briefcase. "Is that yours?" "Yes." "Step away from it." She nodded without hesitation and took one measured step backward. Her movements were so controlled that they almost unsettled him. It felt less like dealing with someone caught off guard and more like someone observing a process she already understood from beginning to end. A notification briefly illuminated the screen of the phone inside the partially open briefcase before fading away again. Neither officer noticed it. Another followed only seconds later. Then another. Somewhere across the city, someone was trying very hard to reach her. But here, surrounded by flashing lights and growing assumptions, those unanswered calls disappeared beneath the noise of public judgment. Daniel believed he had complete control of the situation. After all, the report sounded straightforward. A disturbance, an uncooperative individual, a routine arrest. Nothing about the woman standing before him suggested that today's paperwork would become anything more than another file at the end of his shift. "Last chance," he said. "Anything you want to tell me?" For the first time, she allowed herself the faintest hint of a smile. Not arrogant, not sarcastic, simply patient. "Only this," she answered. "By this afternoon, everyone in this plaza will wish they had paid closer attention to what actually happened instead of what they assumed." The crowd exchanged puzzled looks. Daniel dismissed the comment with a shake of his head. He couldn't have known that less than 2 hours from now, nearly every video being recorded around him would become evidence in a story far bigger than a simple arrest, and that the quiet woman everyone had mistaken for just another face in the crowd was already carrying a truth capable of turning the entire day upside down. A murmur rolled through the growing crowd as Officer Daniel Carter picked up the leather briefcase with one hand and motioned toward the waiting patrol vehicle with the other. The afternoon sun reflected off the courthouse windows, casting long streaks of light across the sidewalk where office workers, tourists, and federal employees had quietly gathered. It was the kind of ordinary weekday that rarely made the evening news. Yet something about the woman's composure made even the loudest voices lower to uncertain whispers. Ava Brooks walked exactly where she was. Instructed, her posture upright and unhurried, as though every step had already been measured before she took it. She did not scan the crowd for sympathy. She did not search for someone to defend her. Instead, she looked briefly toward the courthouse entrance where 2 American flags moved gently in the warm Virginia breeze. For a fleeting second, something crossed her face that almost resembled disappointment, but it disappeared before anyone could recognize it. Daniel noticed the expression and misread it entirely. "You should have thought about this before causing a disturbance," he said confidently. Ava turned toward him with the same calm expression she had worn from the beginning. I have spent my career thinking about consequences, officer. He gave a dismissive laugh, believing the statement was another attempt to sound important. Around them, phone cameras continued recording from every possible angle. A local street musician stopped playing and quietly watched from across the plaza. Two courthouse security officers exchanged uncertain glances but remained where they were, assuming city police knew something they did not. Nearby, a young law student whispered to her classmate, "She does not look nervous." Her friend answered, "Maybe she is just pretending." Neither realized how completely wrong they were. Daniel placed the briefcase on the hood of the patrol vehicle while another officer prepared an inventory sheet. The zipper remained slightly open, revealing only a notebook, several neatly organized folders, and a silver pin resting carefully on top. Everything appeared remarkably ordinary. There was nothing dramatic, nothing suspicious, nothing that suggested the woman standing quietly nearby had any reason to believe this encounter would become unforgettable. Another notification briefly illuminated the screen of the phone resting inside the briefcase before fading again. Then another followed almost immediately. The display flashed only for an instant before the screen turned dark once more. No one paid attention. Daniel continued filling out routine information, convinced he was completing another standard report before returning to patrol. He had no reason to question his assumptions because assumptions had never failed him before. Ava glanced toward the phone but made no request to answer it. She simply allowed the unanswered calls to continue arriving. Her silence puzzled one of the younger officers, who quietly asked, "Do you want us to notify someone?" Ava looked at him with a kindness that seemed strangely out of place given the circumstances. "They already know where I am," she replied. The young officer hesitated, sensing a confidence that did not match the situation, but Daniel interrupted before another word could be spoken. "Save the conversation for processing." The younger officer nodded and stepped back. A black sport utility vehicle turned slowly onto the street bordering the plaza before continuing past without stopping. Ava noticed it immediately. Her eyes followed it only for a second before returning to the courthouse steps. Daniel never looked up. If he had, he might have noticed that the driver briefly slowed as if searching for someone. Instead, he signed another line on the report and closed his notebook with quiet satisfaction. To him, everything remained under control. To everyone watching, the story seemed finished before it had truly begun. Only Ava understood that the most important chapter had not yet revealed itself, and the truth was already moving toward the plaza 1 mile at a time. A cool breeze swept across the plaza as the afternoon traffic continued its steady rhythm, almost indifferent to the unusual scene unfolding outside the courthouse. Officer Daniel Carter finished reviewing his paperwork while the younger officer quietly secured Ava Brooks's briefcase inside the patrol vehicle. The crowd had not dispersed. If anything, more people had gathered, drawn by the irresistible pull of uncertainty. Some believed they were witnessing justice in action. Others simply wanted a story to tell when they returned to work. Few considered that the truth might be far more complicated than the first impression. Ava remained remarkably composed. She stood with her shoulders relaxed, her gaze fixed not on the officers but on the stone columns of the courthouse where generations of lawyers, judges, and ordinary citizens had walked through the same doors seeking fairness. The building represented the promise of equal justice under the law, yet today that promise felt strangely distant. Daniel glanced toward her once more. The absence of fear continued to bother him. He had encountered angry people, frightened people, confused people, and desperate people. This was different. Ava carried herself with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent years inside rooms where every word mattered. It was not arrogance. It was discipline. The kind of discipline built over countless difficult conversations where patience often proved stronger than emotion. One of the bystanders finally spoke loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "If she did nothing wrong, why is she so calm?" An older man standing beside him answered without taking his eyes off the officers. "Sometimes the calmest person knows the most." The words lingered in the air longer than anyone expected. Daniel ignored them. He believed experience had taught him to recognize deception, and he had no intention of second-guessing himself now. "We are leaving," he announced before turning toward Ava. "Do you understand the charge?" She met his eyes with quiet respect. I understand the accusation. Daniel frowned. That is not what I asked. No, she replied evenly. But accuracy matters. For just a moment, neither of them spoke. The younger officer shifted uneasily, sensing tension that had nothing to do with raised voices. It was the silence that felt unusually heavy. Nearby, another notification illuminated the phone resting inside the briefcase. This time the screen remained lit a second longer, displaying several missed calls from the same Washington office before fading once again. The younger officer happened to notice the repeated notifications through the partially open zipper. "Sergeant," he said carefully, "someone has been trying to reach her for quite a while." Daniel barely looked over. People always start making calls after an arrest. The younger officer nodded, but something about the repeated calls continued to trouble him. Across the street, the black sport utility vehicle from earlier appeared again, slowing near the intersection before stopping at a red light. The driver scanned the plaza with growing concern before speaking briefly into a hands-free microphone. The vehicle remained in place only until the light changed, then disappeared around the corner once more. Ava watched it leave without changing her expression. She knew time was moving, even if no one else realized it. Daniel opened the rear passenger door and motioned toward the vehicle. "Let us finish this." Ava paused for only a heartbeat before quietly saying, "Officer Carter, there is still an opportunity to ask one important question before we leave." He folded his arms. "Which question is that?" Her answer came without hesitation. "Who exactly have you decided I am?" The plaza fell strangely quiet again. Daniel offered no reply because, in his mind, the answer seemed obvious. Yet sometimes the greatest mistakes are not made by ignoring the facts that are hidden. They begin by believing the facts you have never questioned. A faint siren echoed several blocks away before fading into the afternoon traffic, leaving behind an uneasy silence that seemed to settle over everyone gathered outside the courthouse. Officer Daniel Carter stood beside the patrol vehicle with growing impatience, convinced that every passing minute only confirmed he had handled the situation correctly. He glanced at his watch, then toward Ava Brooks, whose calm expression remained unchanged despite the dozens of curious eyes fixed upon her. It frustrated him more than he cared to admit. Most people tried to explain themselves. Most demanded answers. Ava simply waited. "You are making this more difficult than it has to be," Daniel said. Ava answered with the same measured tone she had maintained from the beginning. "I have not refused a single instruction, officer." He paused, realizing she was technically correct. She had complied with every request without argument. Yet somehow that only deepened his certainty that she was hiding something. Across the sidewalk, two courthouse employees quietly discussed the scene while pretending not to stare. "She looks like an attorney," one of them whispered. "Maybe," the other replied. "Or maybe appearances fool people." The younger officer heard the conversation but remained silent. His attention had returned to the partially open briefcase resting inside the patrol vehicle. Another notification illuminated the screen of the phone. This time the preview remained visible long enough for him to recognize an unfamiliar government email address before the display went dark again. He hesitated. "Sergeant, perhaps we should verify her identity once more before transport." Daniel barely turned his head. "Her identification has already been logged." "Yes, sir, but there have been repeated calls and messages." Daniel closed the report folder with quiet confidence. "People can claim anything over the phone. We deal with facts." Ava listened without interrupting. After a brief moment she spoke, not to challenge him, but almost as if offering professional advice. "Facts become more reliable when every available piece of information is examined." Daniel met her eyes. "You really enjoy giving lectures, do not you?" A faint smile crossed her face. "No, I simply believe careful decisions protect everyone." Her answer lingered longer than expected. Even several people in the crowd exchanged thoughtful looks. The words carried no accusation. They sounded like a principle she had repeated many times before. At that moment, a courthouse clock chimed the half hour. Ava quietly looked toward the entrance once again. Whatever meeting she had intended to attend had almost certainly begun without her. There was no sign of frustration, only the smallest trace of concern that someone else might now be waiting unnecessarily. The younger officer finally gathered enough confidence to ask another question. "Ma'am, was someone expecting you today?" Ava nodded once. "Several people." "For what?" Daniel interrupted before she could answer. It does not matter. Ava slowly shifted her attention back to him. It matters to them. Another brief silence settled over the plaza. Somewhere nearby, a reporter carrying a camera hurried toward the growing crowd after receiving a tip about an unusual arrest outside the federal courthouse. More phones were now pointed toward the officers than before. People sensed that something about the encounter refused to fit the simple story they had first imagined. Daniel remained determined to finish what he had started. He reached for the patrol vehicle door once again, unaware that events beyond his view had already begun moving toward him with quiet precision. Less than a mile away, inside a federal office building, an assistant looked up from a conference table and realized one chair remained empty. The room fell silent as another unanswered call went directly to voicemail. No one there knew exactly what had happened. They only knew that Ava Brooks had never once missed an appearance without an explanation, and that single unexpected absence was enough to send several experienced professionals searching for answers. Ignorance rarely announces itself with loud words. More often, it hides inside quiet certainty. The afternoon shadows stretched a little farther across the courthouse plaza as the crowd continued watching a scene that none of them realized was slowly changing direction. Officer Daniel Carter believed he had reached the final chapter of a routine encounter. Ava Brooks knew they were still reading the first page. The younger officer opened the patrol vehicle to place the inventory sheet beside the briefcase. As he adjusted the paperwork, the zipper shifted slightly farther open. A thick folder became visible for only a moment before another folder slid over it. Across the tab, several dark blue letters could be seen before disappearing again. He blinked, wondering if he had imagined them. Before he could look closer, Daniel called his name. Everything finished? Almost, Sergeant. The younger officer closed the compartment without another word, but the image stayed in his mind. Those letters looked familiar, although he could not immediately remember why. A few feet away, Ava quietly observed the exchange without reacting. She had noticed the brief glimpse as well, yet she offered no explanation. Experience had taught her that people were far more likely to trust discoveries they made themselves than answers they received too early. Another notification illuminated the phone inside the briefcase. This time it displayed a calendar reminder before fading away. The screen revealed only a few words. Civil Rights Strategy Meeting, 12:30. The younger officer caught the first line before the display disappeared. His curiosity grew stronger. Sergeant, he asked carefully, should we contact the number calling her? Daniel sighed with visible impatience. No, we complete the process first. Questions later. The answer sounded perfectly reasonable to everyone listening. Procedures existed for a reason. Yet procedures also depended upon complete information, and complete information remained just inches away inside a leather briefcase no one considered important enough to examine carefully. Across the street, the reporter finally reached the edge of the gathering crowd. Instead of rushing toward the officers, she began interviewing witnesses. Every answer sounded different. One person claimed the woman had argued loudly. Another admitted they had arrived after the officers were already speaking with her. A third quietly confessed that she had never actually heard Ava raise her voice at all. The reporter frowned. The stories did not match. Daniel remained focused on finishing his paperwork. He handed another form to the younger officer while speaking with practiced confidence. Most situations become complicated because people refuse to cooperate. Ava answered before anyone else could. Sometimes they become complicated because people reach conclusions before collecting every fact. Daniel looked at her again. You seem very certain about that. Years of experience, she replied gently. There was something unusual about the way she said it. Not defensive, not proud, simply factual. The younger officer studied her expression. It reminded him of attorneys he had occasionally seen inside courtrooms, professionals who measured every sentence because every word might matter later. The thought unsettled him. Nearby, two courthouse employees suddenly recognized Ava from a distance. They exchanged uncertain glances, but hesitated to interrupt. One whispered, "Is that really her?" The other narrowed his eyes, trying to be certain from across the plaza. Before either could move, a black sport utility vehicle slowly turned back onto the street and stopped along the curb without activating any emergency lights. Two professionally dressed individuals stepped out and looked toward the growing crowd with calm but unmistakable purpose. They did not run. They did not shout. They simply scanned the scene until their eyes settled on one familiar face standing quietly beside the patrol vehicle. Ava noticed them immediately. For the first time that afternoon, the smallest trace of relief appeared in her expression, while everyone else remained completely unaware that the assumptions guiding the entire encounter were only moments away from colliding with the truth. 4 hours earlier, the same courthouse plaza had felt completely different. The sidewalks were quieter, the air carried the familiar rhythm of another government workday, and Ava Brooks stepped out of a rideshare carrying the same leather briefcase that now rested inside a patrol vehicle. She paused for only a moment to look toward the courthouse before checking the time on her phone. She was exactly 7 minutes ahead of schedule, just as she preferred. Punctuality had never been about appearances. It was about respect for every person waiting inside the conference room. As she crossed the plaza, her phone rang. "Good afternoon," she answered warmly. "Yes, I will be there in just a few minutes." The voice on the other end confirmed that representatives from several federal offices had already arrived. A senior attorney from Washington was joining by secure video conference. A Civil Rights Division director had adjusted an afternoon hearing to attend. Everyone expected Ava to lead the discussion because she had spent years earning a reputation for preparation, fairness, and careful judgment. She thanked the caller and ended the conversation with the same words she often repeated before important meetings. "The facts will guide us." She believed those words with her whole heart. Throughout her career, she had reminded young attorneys that assumptions solved nothing, while evidence protected everyone equally. Her work was never about winning for the sake of victory. It was about making certain that the law remained worthy of the public trust. As she continued walking, another message appeared on her phone confirming the meeting agenda. Civil Rights Strategy Session. Attendance required. Lead presenter, Ava Brooks. She briefly reviewed several notes before placing the phone back inside her briefcase beside a collection of organized case files marked with federal documentation. Each folder represented months of interviews, legal research, and careful review. None of it had been rushed because justice could not afford shortcuts. A courthouse employee held the entrance door open as Ava approached. "Good afternoon, Ms. Brooks," he said with a friendly smile. "Good afternoon," she replied. "Beautiful day, is not it?" "Sure is. They are already waiting upstairs." Ava smiled politely and continued toward the security entrance, greeting several familiar faces along the way. She never expected special treatment. Most people passing through the building simply knew her as someone who listened carefully before speaking. Even during difficult disagreements, she remained remarkably calm, believing respect often accomplished more than volume. Before entering the building, she noticed a small commotion developing across the street. A few pedestrians had stopped to watch something unfold near the intersection. She glanced in that direction for only a second, thinking little of it. There was still plenty of time before the meeting began. She adjusted the strap of her briefcase and changed direction slightly, intending to walk around the gathering crowd rather than through it. She had no way of knowing that a series of ordinary decisions made by strangers over the next several minutes would place her at the center of an encounter no one inside the courthouse could have imagined. At that same moment, inside a conference room overlooking the plaza, an empty chair waited quietly beside a stack of briefing materials. A nameplate rested neatly in front of it. It read only 2 words, simple enough to escape attention from anyone passing by. Yet those words carried years of responsibility, experience, and public service. Ava Brooks. The conference room overlooking the courthouse had fallen unusually quiet. 12 people sat around the long table, their briefing folders already open, yet one chair remained empty. The assistant checked the time again before looking toward the senior attorney joining from Washington through a secure video connection. "She has never been late," someone said softly. No one questioned the statement because everyone in the room knew it was true. Ava Brooks had built a reputation on preparation, discipline, and respect for the process. If she was missing, there had to be a reason. One of the attorneys reached for his phone and called again. Straight to voicemail. Another tried immediately afterward. The same result. Concern slowly replaced impatience. "Has anyone spoken with courthouse security?" the director asked. A staff member made the call while another opened the shared calendar. Every appointment remained exactly as planned. There were no cancellations, no emergency messages, no explanation. Then a legal assistant quietly said, "She checked in with me less than 15 minutes before the meeting. She was already outside." The room became still. Outside. That meant she had almost reached the building. The director stood and walked toward the window overlooking the plaza. From several stories above, he could see flashing emergency lights and an unusually large crowd gathered along the sidewalk. It looked like an ordinary police stop from a distance, something people in a busy downtown barely noticed anymore. He would have turned away if one detail had not caught his attention. A familiar charcoal gray business suit. His expression changed instantly. "Zoom in," he said to another staff member holding a tablet connected to the building's security cameras. The image sharpened. There she was. Ava Brooks stood quietly beside a patrol vehicle while officers completed paperwork. Nobody inside the conference room spoke for several long seconds. The silence carried more weight than panic ever could. Finally, the director exhaled slowly. "That is impossible." Another attorney stared at the screen before saying, "They cannot possibly know who she is." The director answered without taking his eyes off the image. "Apparently, they do not." He immediately turned toward the assistant. "Contact the Department of Justice liaison. Notify Federal Protective Service. Inform them that Senior Department of Justice litigator Ava Brooks appears to have been detained outside the courthouse while en route to a scheduled civil rights strategy meeting." Every person in the room suddenly moved with calm efficiency. No one shouted. No one rushed blindly. Phones were picked up. Secure numbers were dialed. Brief factual updates replaced speculation. Within moments, several federal offices had been notified. Back outside, none of that activity was visible. Officer Daniel Carter remained convinced he was finishing routine paperwork, while the younger officer quietly wondered why so many unanswered calls had arrived from government offices. Ava remained exactly where she had been asked to stand. Her patience never wavered because she understood something few people ever appreciated. Truth did not become stronger by speaking louder. It became stronger when every missing piece finally arrived. Less than 2 minutes later, the black sport utility vehicle stopped along the curb once again. This time its passengers did not hesitate. They walked toward the plaza with steady confidence, each carrying official credentials beneath their jackets. They had not come to argue. They had come to identify the woman everyone else had mistaken for a stranger, and with every measured step they took, the distance between assumption and reality became smaller than ever before. The conversations across the plaza faded into an uneasy hush as the two professionally dressed officials approached with steady, deliberate steps. They did not raise their voices or draw attention to themselves. Their confidence alone caused several people in the crowd to instinctively move aside. Officer Daniel Carter looked up from his paperwork, expecting another routine question from curious bystanders. Instead, one of the visitors calmly displayed an official credential. "Good afternoon, officer. We are looking for Ms. Ava Brooks." Daniel nodded toward the woman standing beside the patrol vehicle. "She is currently being detained while we complete our investigation." The official acknowledged the statement with a slight nod before turning toward Ava. "Ms. Brooks, we have been trying to reach you for the last 20 minutes. Ava answered with the same calm composure she had maintained all afternoon. "I know. My phone has been unavailable." The younger officer glanced toward the briefcase, suddenly remembering every unanswered call and every notification he had ignored. A second official stepped closer and spoke respectfully. "The Civil Rights Strategy meeting cannot begin without you. The Assistant Attorney General and the litigation team are waiting." The words landed with startling clarity. Several people standing nearby looked at one another in confusion. Daniel frowned, believing he had misunderstood. "What meeting?" The first official met his eyes. "The Department of Justice Civil Rights Strategy meeting. Ms. Brooks is the senior litigator leading today's session." For the first time since the encounter began, Daniel's confidence visibly faltered. He looked from the officials to Ava and then back again, searching for some sign that this was a misunderstanding. There was none. The younger officer quietly opened the briefcase, this time with careful attention. Inside, every document was meticulously organized. A dark blue credential holder rested on top of a federal case file. He carefully lifted it into view. The gold seal caught the afternoon sunlight. Beneath it were the words he had only glimpsed before. United States Department of Justice. Senior litigator. Ava Brooks. He stared at the identification for several long seconds before silently handing it to Daniel. The plaza became remarkably still. Even the reporter stopped asking questions as every nearby phone remained fixed on the unfolding scene. Daniel examined the credential carefully, then looked again at Ava. Everything she had said suddenly carried an entirely different meaning. Her calm had not come from defiance. It had come from confidence in the truth. Her repeated requests to document everything no longer sounded unusual. They sounded professional. The official spoke again, his tone remaining courteous. "Officer, we appreciate your cooperation. We will need to understand the circumstances that delayed a scheduled federal proceeding." There was no accusation in his voice, only a request for facts. Ava quietly watched the exchange without interruption. She neither celebrated nor criticized anyone standing before her. She simply waited for the process she had trusted from the beginning to finally catch up with reality. Around the plaza, assumptions dissolved one by one. The people who had rushed to judgment now realized they had witnessed only a fraction of the story. Daniel slowly lowered the credential, understanding that the woman he had confidently identified as an ordinary suspect had been, from the very beginning, one of the nation's most experienced attorneys dedicated to protecting the very principles he had sworn to uphold. Ava Brooks accepted her briefcase with a quiet nod of appreciation before carefully placing the Department of Justice credential back inside. The plaza remained almost perfectly silent. Only moments earlier, strangers had been certain they understood the entire situation. Now many of those same people lowered their phones, realizing they had witnessed how quickly assumptions could outrun the truth. Officer Daniel Carter stood motionless, the confidence that had guided every decision replaced by thoughtful reflection. The official from the Department of Justice spoke with calm professionalism. "Our priority now is ensuring that Ms. Brooks arrives safely, so today's federal proceedings may continue as scheduled. Questions regarding this encounter can be addressed through the appropriate review process." There was no anger in his voice and no demand for public embarrassment, only respect for procedure. Ava turned toward Daniel with the same composed expression she had carried from the beginning. She could have reminded everyone that she had warned them to document everything. She could have listed each moment when a different decision might have changed the outcome. Instead, she simply asked one quiet question. "Officer, would you like to know why I remained?" Calm. Daniel looked at her and slowly nodded. "Yes." Ava glanced briefly toward the courthouse before answering. "Because the law is strongest when emotions do not replace facts. If I believe in equal justice for everyone, then I have to believe it will protect me as well." Those words settled over the plaza with greater force than any raised voice ever could. The younger officer lowered his eyes, remembering every opportunity to pause, verify, and ask one more question. He understood that experience was valuable, but humility was essential. The reporter quietly ended her recording without adding speculation. She realized the real story had never been about a dramatic confrontation. It had been about the extraordinary consequences of ordinary assumptions. One by one, the bystanders began walking away. Their conversations sounded different now. Some admitted they had judged too quickly. Others wondered how often similar moments happened without anyone discovering the full truth. Inside the courthouse, the waiting attorneys finally saw Ava approaching through the entrance. Several greeted her with visible relief, yet she offered only a brief apology for the delay before walking directly into the conference room. There was important work to do, and she refused to allow one difficult afternoon to distract from the people depending upon that work. Behind her, the review process quietly began exactly as it should. Reports would be examined. Body camera recordings would be preserved. Witness statements would be collected. Every decision would be evaluated through established procedures because accountability was not about revenge. It was about preserving public trust. As the courthouse doors closed behind Ava, the afternoon sunlight reflected once more across the empty plaza where the crowd had gathered only minutes before. The place looked ordinary again, yet everyone who had remained until the end carried home a lesson that reached far beyond one encounter. Authority earns respect when it is guided by fairness. Experience gains wisdom when it leaves room for questions. And dignity belongs to every person long before anyone learns their title, profession, or position. Because in the end, the greatest measure of justice is not how we treat the powerful after we recognize them. It is how we choose to treat the stranger before we know who they are.